Imagine being a waitress at a small, cozy diner, just going through the motions of your everyday shift. Then, one fateful encounter changes everything. It's a chilly afternoon when a homeless man walks in, his clothes tattered and his face weathered by life struggles. He quietly sits at the counter, barely speaking a word. You notice him, of course. How could you not? But instead of judgment, you offer him kindness. A warm smile, a cup of coffee, and a listening ear. Little did you know, this simple act of compassion would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. As the day goes on, the man leaves quietly, just as he arrived. But before he walks out the door, he leaves behind something that will leave everyone in shock. What happens next will make you believe in the power of kindness and how one small gesture can change someone's life forever. But that's not the end of the story. Stay tuned to find out what happens when this unexpected gesture of goodwill turns into something unimaginable. What did he leave behind? And how did it change everything for the waitress? The diner was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel the weight of time moving slowly. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, almost as if it was counting down to something. The waitress, still processing the strange encounter, was wiping down the counter when she noticed the folded piece of paper. It was tucked neatly beside the sugar container, and it looked completely out of place. The homeless man who had barely spoken a word all afternoon had left it there. She paused for a moment, unsure whether to open it. Something about the way he had left, almost like he was in a hurry, felt strange. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. There, written in neat handwriting, was a message for your kindness. You'll know what to do with it. Beneath the words, there was a crisp $100 bill. Her heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary tip. She stared at the bill for a moment, her mind racing. Was it a mistake? Had he meant to leave it for someone else? But the message, so direct, so personal, made it clear this was for her. She looked around the diner, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The place was empty except for a few regulars, none of whom seemed to notice the sudden shift in the air. The waitress felt a knot form in her stomach. She had heard stories of people who had been scammed or tricked, and a part of her wondered if this was one of those situations. But then she thought back to the man's eyes. There had been something in them. A weariness, yes, but also a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was his way of saying thank you for seeing him as more than just a homeless person. The waitress placed the money in her apron pocket and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that lingered. She had to finish her shift. But the thought of that $100 bill kept gnawing at her, like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. What did it mean? Why had he left it? And what was she supposed to do with it? As the evening wore on, the diner began to fill up with more customers. The usual chatter and clinking of silverware provided a welcome distraction, but the waitress couldn't stop thinking about the man and the money. She had worked in the diner for years, serving food to people who came and went, each with their own stories. Some were kind, some were rude, but they all left eventually. This man, though, was different. She felt it deep in her bones. And now, she couldn't help but wonder he had left her with a message she hadn't fully understood yet. The next day, as she walked into the diner for her shift, something felt off. The air was thick with anticipation, like something was about to happen. She tried to push the feeling aside, focusing on her tasks. But then, as she passed by the window, she saw him again. The homeless man. He was standing across the street, watching the diner from a distance. Her heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively turned away. Was he watching her? Or was he just lost in thought, staring out into the world that had been so unkind to him? She tried to shake the thought from her mind, but it stuck with her all day. He didn't come inside. He didn't approach the diner. But he was always there, lurking just beyond the glass, like a shadow. She couldn't figure out why he was there or what he wanted. And that uncertainty gnawed at her, making it hard to focus on anything else. As the days passed, the man's presence became a constant. He wasn't always there, but he appeared often enough to make her uneasy. Sometimes he would stand outside the diner for hours, watching. Other times, he would disappear for days, only to return when she least expected it. And every time he was there, she would feel a strange sense of dread mixed with curiosity. What did he want from her? Was this some kind of game? Or was there something more to it? One evening, as the diner was about to close, she saw him again. This time, he wasn't standing across the street. He was right outside the door, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. There was something in his gaze, something desperate, something pleading. She felt a chill run down her spine. He wasn't just watching her anymore. He was waiting for something. Without thinking, she walked to the door and opened it. The man didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at her, as if he had been waiting for this moment. You left me a tip, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Why? The man didn't speak for a long time. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving hers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. It wasn't just for the coffee, he said softly. It was for something else. Her heart raced. What do you mean? The man took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly. I've been watching you, he said, his voice barely audible. I know what you've been through. I know what it's like to feel invisible. But you didn't look at me like everyone else does. You didn't turn away. And that means more than you'll ever know. The waitress felt a lump form in her throat. She had never thought of herself as special, never imagined that her small act of kindness could mean so much to someone else. But here he was, telling her that her actions had made a difference in his life. And that, in itself, was a revelation. But there was more. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just grateful. He was trying to tell her something. Something important. But before she could ask, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The waitress stood there for a long time, the weight of his words hanging in the air. What had he meant? What was he trying to tell her? And why had he chosen her? As the days went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The man had left her with more than just a tip. He had left her with a question that lingered in her mind, growing louder with each passing day. What was she supposed to do with the money? What was the real message behind his kindness? And most importantly, what would happen if she didn't figure it out? The tension between the waitress and the homeless man continued to build, and she found herself increasingly consumed by the mystery of it all. Every day, she looked out the window, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting. But no matter how hard she searched, he was never there. It was as if he had vanished completely. But the nagging sense that something was about to change remained. And with it, the unsettling realization that the story wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. The days after the man had walked away were filled with an overwhelming sense of anticipation. The waitress couldn't stop thinking about him, about the cryptic message he had left behind, and the strange connection they had formed in such a short time. She found herself scanning the streets outside the diner every time she stepped into the kitchen, hoping for a glimpse of him, but he was never there. It was as though he had vanished completely, leaving only the unanswered questions lingering in her mind. But life, as it often does, continued. The diner remained as busy as ever, filled with the usual faces, and the waitress did her best to put the strange encounter behind her. She focused on her work, on the regulars who came in for their morning coffee, and the new customers who passed through the door. Yet, despite her best efforts to move on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. One afternoon, as she was wiping down the counter, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was the homeless man. He stood there, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. This time, though, he wasn't alone. He had a young woman with him, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with uncertainty. The waitress's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the woman's face. She had seen her before, just a few days ago, sitting on a bench outside the diner, looking lost and alone. The woman had been homeless too, but she had disappeared as quickly as she had arrived. The man walked toward the counter, his hand gently resting on the woman's shoulder. She looked up at the waitress, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. The waitress's heart went out to her. She could see the same pain in the woman's eyes that she had seen in the man's all those days ago. "Is she okay?" the waitress asked softly, her voice filled with concern. The man nodded slowly. "She's been through a lot," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But she's trying to get back on her feet. I thought maybe you could help her." The waitress didn't hesitate. She had learned long ago that kindness wasn't always easy. The waitress didn't hesitate. She had learned long ago that kindness wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. She smiled warmly at the woman, gestured to the seat beside her. "Of course," she said. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." The woman hesitated for a moment, then slowly sat down, her eyes darting around the diner as if she were unsure of her place in the world. The man took a seat beside her, his hands still resting on her shoulder, offering her a sense of comfort and security. For the next few hours, the waitress watched as the two of them sat together, talking in low voices, sharing stories of their lives. She could see the bond between them growing stronger with each passing minute. The man had been through so much, and now he was trying to help someone else who was struggling just as he had. It was a beautiful thing to witness, and the waitress couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for what she had been a part of, even if it was just a small part. As the day came to a close, the woman stood up, her face a little brighter than it had been when she first walked in. She looked at the waitress with a sense of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The waitress smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "You're stronger than you think." The man stood as well, his eyes meeting the waitress's. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a shared recognition of the power of kindness and the way it could change lives. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to the waitress. She took it, her fingers brushing against his, and looked at him in confusion. "Please," he said, his voice low. "It's for you." The waitress opened the envelope slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she found another $100 bill, along with a note that read, "For the one who saw us. You've made a difference in ways you'll never know." Her breath caught in her throat. She had never expected anything in return for her kindness. She had simply done what felt right in the moment, offering a little warmth to someone who needed it. And yet, here it was again, a gesture of gratitude that was more than just a tip. It was a reminder that the world could still be a good place, that kindness could still make a difference. The man and the woman left the diner together, walking out into the night, their steps a little lighter than they had been when they first arrived. The waitress watched them go, her heart full. She helped them, yes, but they had also helped her in ways she hadn't even realized. They had reminded her that the world wasn't always as cold and indifferent as it seemed. There were still people out there who cared, who were willing to show up for each other, even when it seemed like no one else would. The next morning, the waitress sat down at the counter, looking at the money the man had left her. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the connection, the bond that had been formed between them. She knew that she had made a difference in their lives, but they had also made a difference in hers. She had learned something important. Kindness didn't always have to be big or traumatic. Sometimes it was the small things that mattered most: the smile, the cup of coffee, the moment of human connection. As the days passed, the waitress continued to work at the diner, serving customers and going about her routine. But she never forgot the man and the woman. She thought about them often, wondering where they were and how they were doing. She hoped they were finding their way, just as she had found her own way, in the quiet moments of kindness and compassion. And every now and then, when she looked out the window and saw someone standing on the corner, she couldn't help but wonder if it was him again, waiting for her to see him once more. But no matter what, she knew that the story wasn't really over. It was just a reminder that, in a world that often felt disconnected and cold, there were still moments of grace, still chances to make a difference, still opportunities to change lives. The waitress never saw the homeless man again, but she carried his message with her, tucked away in her heart. A message of hope, of kindness, and of the power of seeing others for who they truly were. She knew that she would continue to pay it forward, to offer warmth and compassion to anyone who needed it, just as she had when the man had first walked into the diner. Because in the end, it wasn't about the money or the tips. It was about the way we show up for each other, the way we care, and the way we choose to see the world. And that, she realized, was the most valuable thing of all.